I love that about teaching New York and teaching. Are we recording this, by the way? Just as a logistical question.
Yeah, I'm starting the recording now. I'm glad you remind me of that. Yeah, it is.
I love that about teaching New York and teaching. Are we recording this? Getting an echo for some reason. That's strange.
Yeah, I'm starting the recording now. I'm glad you go for it. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. Great. So folks, New York City, 13, 14 years, 600 graduates. We do it as a weekend format. Everybody does an individual design in order to graduate, which is a radical difference from most permaculture design certification courses where students do group design for the same site. Group design for the same site doesn't actually teach you as an individual how to do permaculture. I'm much more about making sure every single student who studies with us actually knows what we taught them. That matters to me. I taught at a high school for 10 years. Full curriculums that I created of my own that are state certified high school diploma credible for the state of Pennsylvania, where I taught at a school called Apatinas. Apatinas was a K through 12 program. There was a free school, much like what some of you might be familiar with of a school in the area that's called Sudbury Valley. If you've ever heard of Sudbury, Sudbury is of the ilk of the school that I both taught at for 10 years and graduated from in 1986. And I went on to go to an undergraduate college. It was a Quaker school. I was raised Quaker in Chester County, Pennsylvania. And I don't necessarily espouse any particular religion these days, but if there was one that I could cozy up to, probably because of familiarity and shared values, it'd be Quakerism. Quakers are very radical. They're very liberal. They're very open-minded. They're very anti-military. They're very heavily steeped in conflict resolution, as well as being the heavyweights of consensus process is something that I was also very well educated in, because the school where I taught for 10 years was run collaboratively by the students. And so, and students received no grades and just received credits and an evaluation. So I like education. I see education as a tool for social change. In other words, I'm an educator who has an agenda. And my agenda is to influence the world and influence every person who comes into my sphere to think about the planet as something that you have power to influence in a way that you want to be intentional with. You want to really bring a lot of intentionality to how you live as a human being on this earth. And it's that consciousness that I've felt is my passion and mission in life to materialize more so into the physical world, is this capacity for human beings to collaborate in a cooperative and potentized way to transform our lives and transform the planet. So I don't know where folks want to go, but we're going to get a chance to talk more after this as well. So I'm not going to take up a whole lot more time on a long introduction, but I would like to, I think it's important that you know that I also did live off the grid for 8 years in West Virginia, where I built my own homestead with a lot of materials from the property where I built it. And it was specifically a self-designed permaculture PhD educational experience, because it was post having studied permaculture at the farm in Tennessee in 1996. The farm being the largest eco-village hippie commune in Eastern United States on 1,400 acres. That's in Summertown, Tennessee, with Ina Mae Gaskin arguably being the heavyweight, even though everybody followed Stephen Gaskin to create the farm, who was a professor of metaphysics at Berkeley, and a bunch of hippies in school buses who were following the Grateful Dead also followed Stephen Gaskin to Summertown, Tennessee, where he decided, you know, Stephen's metaphor was that if he couldn't drop acid with everybody who joined the farm, then the farm had gotten too big. And that actually happened apparently when they crossed the tipping point of about 600 people. They had 1,200 people living on 1,400 acres at one point. And a lot of people apparently they didn't know how to do basic hygiene. People got giardia and contamination from fecal coliform, which is probably because of poorly maintained outhouses and other such things. So the farm turned into a hippie commune of 200 people on 1,400 acres, and it's where I studied permaculture design in 1996. And it is something that I think is cool, important, part of my lineage to share with you, and something that I saw the limitations of as the solution that we aspire for. Meaning, as somebody who can relate to subculture lifestyles, I don't necessarily think that everybody wants to join an eco-village or do psychoactive drugs in order to reach enlightenment, right? And so how do we all collectively create a world where we're just connected to what it is that matters, which is how the earth works and how nature works? And so that's what this film is about, is how do we scale up permaculture to be something that we know people who are going to love it and care for it and use it as a means to create the Ithaca eco-village, or to create Earth Haven, or to create the farm, right? Or to create other eco-villages and intentional communities like Sirius Community, like Earth Dance. But can we get it beyond the subculture bubble into something that is actually transformative, because we need to transform mainstream society? You know, like I like to say, a way has gone away. There is no place to really get away from what happens when nuclear power plants are emitting isotopes that rain down on our vegetable gardens at our eco-village. And so to me, this film is about the bigger picture ways in which we can really turn around a lot of patterns of how civilization functions.
Great.
So really appreciate you all digging into this with us tonight and taking some time to learn about some ideas that I think we've done a good job with the film of really distilling them down to some important nuggets that I think really are across the board ideas that many people can relate to. And those two nuggets would be basically food and energy. And how do we go about transforming how we produce food to be more localized, to be more diversified, to be more ecological, and how we produce energy to be more nature-based, to be done in a way that's lower tech, to be diverse, to be appropriately scaled. Right? And so when we combine food and energy, I think we can address a bunch of other issues that if we don't address things in a simultaneity and we just focus on food or we just focus on energy, we don't get the same cascade effect that we're looking for. So that's what the film's about. And it focuses on the watershed where the Center for Bioregional Living is located, which is our educational campus about an hour and a half north of New York City.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrew. So we're going to start streaming the movie. It's going to go for 30 minutes, and then we'll connect back with each other. So see you all very soon on the other side.
Thank you.
Start being able to see the movie. So give me just a minute to start it, so we can all connect.
How often do we ask ourselves, how does the earth work? And largely it's not something that we tend to be very cognizant of, that we are on an amazingly well-designed, well-functioning ecosystem, services providing planetary phenomenon. How does this planet work? And it's oftentimes not something that we're thinking about or paying attention to or saying to ourselves, hey, I am nested within this planetary thing that really I don't understand. And we don't generally stay curious about it as well. And we'll find that that's one of the most important things to having a good life, is being curious, being interested, asking questions about the world. How does the world work? We live in a culture that is very much as William Burroughs calls it, created a gray, dead world due to the presupposition that science has got it all figured out. When in fact we'll find that, well, science is a useful tool and we're using it in this analysis here, it certainly is not the be-all end-all of what it is that we're putting together, which is a vision of how it is we can go food independent, energy independent, and become more connected to how the meta system of the earth itself works. It seems conceivable to me that when we live and realize that we do live on a planet in outer space, circling a massive thermonuclear furnace that is the core of our entire existence, which is why it's called a solar system, because everything revolves around the sun. How much of the mass of our solar system is in the sun? Again, we don't often ask questions like that for some reason, and yet it's the primary driver of all life as we know it, and it is 99.6% of the mass of our solar system is in the sun. And I think that's why it's clearly empirically relevant to ask the question, how do we begin to design systems that pay attention to the biological living entities that have been adapting to the sun for billions of years on planet Earth, rather than thinking the way that we tap into the sun, for instance, is simply through a photovoltaic panel or through generating electricity. We'll find that really the best way to first tap into solar income is with trees, is with plants, is with animals, is with human beings having a good diet that's produced by trees, plants, and animals, rather than thinking that we're going to grow a bunch of synthetic food like this Impossible Burger that's been created, that's made from genetically modified soy and has nothing to do with something that biologically naturally occurs on the planet. So the two questions are, how do we feed people? How do we create energy? And how do we achieve the basic independence and quality of life that we're all looking for? So some of the image here behind me is looking at the watershed that we reside within right here, which is the Hudson Valley River watershed, which is approximately 14,000 square miles in its drainage basin, which adds up to somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,960,000 acres of land. And when we're asking a question, for instance, how do we begin to go food independent? How do we eat? And how do we eat in a way that makes sense for where we live? And the second one is energy. How do we have material comforts? How do we take, as I like to say it, a long hot shower and not feel guilty about it because it requires huge standing militaries, giant nuclear power plants, and strip mining in West Virginia in order to be able to do things like take a hot shower, cook our food, have lights on at night. It seems to me that these are fairly domestic and mundane activities that could be achieved with a lot more elegance and a lot more finesse. And what the present system does is what I like to characterize as bludgeoning diversity and complexity with homogeneity, uniformity, and centralized power, energy, and food systems. And we have a population that's held hostage to a global import-export economy just to have the basic needs of their lives met. For instance, dinner on the table, clothes on their back, lights on at night, heat in the wintertime. The Hudson, because it is so large, 8,960,000 acres of land, we're going to boil it down to a subwatershed. And what we're going to be looking at here in particular is the Rondout watershed in Ulster County. The Rondout is a subwatershed of the Hudson, and it takes up about 1,124 square miles of land. The drainage basin is referring to when rain lands in that particular pattern on the planet, it ends up in the Rondout. The Rondout is the main stem here that we're looking at that starts here at a reservoir that feeds New York City through an aqueduct system and then flows out of the dam and flows actually, unusually for river systems in the northern hemisphere, it flows north rather than south to the city of Kingston where it hits the Hudson. The real opportunity to go food independent and energy independent in part is connected to the ability for them to begin to have a visual and a geographic understanding of where they live. And this is where the Center for Bioregional Living resides, as we are right in the Bierkill subwatershed of the Hudson. And this is part of why it's a focus area for our study. We need to transform how it is we're doing agriculture. Make something that isn't so tractor heavy, hybrid heavy, and chemical heavy become how it is that we provide real healthy food for people, healthy food for all. We'll find that there's very clear evidence from many different studies triangulating on the question of how much of the food within a local population and the landscape where they live is grown within that landscape. In other words, when people are living in a particular area, how much of what they're consuming actually comes from the area. And this number we're looking at is pretty much what it is that study after study is agreeing upon. We're looking at a number of 90% when we talk about how much of the food that people consume is coming from where they live. Well, 90% of it is not coming from where they live. It's coming from outside of where they live. And I would suggest to you that that is a very vulnerable place for a human population to be, because now we have no independence, no autonomy, no control over food security. We also have a food system that leaves a toxic wasteland across the entire countryside. And many of the Superfund sites in the Midwest are from atrazine and from Roundup and from groundwater contamination. And these are a legacy of this import-export economy. They're a legacy of our dependence upon centralized transportation of goods and services, the movement of things like electricity from nuclear power plants, from coal-burning power plants, the amount that we rely upon petrochemicals to do mundane things like grow food for us. We also live in a country where 37% of our rivers and streams, according to the federal government, so you can be sure it's worse than that, 37% unfishable and unswimmable, 50% of lakes and ponds not safe for our children to go take a dip in, and that is a sign of a failed, flawed system that we can absolutely do a better job than that, and that's why the focus is on food independence, energy independence, lights on, dinner on the table, clothes on our back, and true autonomy and food security being the essential solution to why it is that so many of the nation's waterways are in fact polluted due to the manner in which we grow food and the manner in which we generate electricity. And in fact, the US government estimates that the single largest non-point source of pollution in the entire country is agriculture. We want to adapt agriculture to topography, to water, to the landscape, to keep all of these impacts of erosion and deforestation from getting into our waterways so that people can have good food, a good life, and good rivers and streams and ponds to go swimming in, and to eventually be able to eat a nice bounty of wild protein from fish that come back into those waterways as we move farms out of the floodplain and reforest the riparian landscapes, the places next to the streams, next to the rivers, and next to the ponds, with a diverse forest ecology that prevents erosion, prevents pollution, and provides a nice abundance of wild-caught shad, wild-caught brook trout, wild-caught rainbow trout. Trees are still the best solar collector on Earth, especially when they are integrated with grazing animals on diversified farms designed to be ecological and highly productive. Right? Not just trees, any old trees, but trees in particular that provide a multiplicity of beneficial yields, become the foundation of our civilization as we diversify farming and agriculture to be more place-based, to be more full diet, to be more year-round. Here's a farm that I installed in Pennsylvania that is a nice example of the appropriate use of tractors to establish market scale farms to be minimally machine based. And what I mean by that is that really we want to figure out how to appropriately use the technologies that we have at hand to ultimately set up landscapes that don't require the continued input of that technology, because it is fossil fuel heavy, because it creates a lot of compaction in the soil, because it cuts down on the amount of rainwater infiltration, and it increases the amount of runoff and erosion that happens when you continue to tractor farm unnecessarily. Here's this farm planted out, and we have a real diversity of plants going on here. We have lupins and basil and cabbages, and these will go into creating real medicinally potent crops that can be stored all winter long, like kimchi and sauerkraut and garlic. We also planted out this farm in blueberries, in strawberries, in cosmos and flowers. And it turns out that if we look at the financials of this, that in fact, small diversified farms that incorporate perennials like fruits and fresh market yields actually make more money per acre than simply one crop farms that grow massive amounts of a single yield, but don't provide as many high quality yields over the entire growing season. We also live in a place that's very rich in rainwater, and it is vastly underutilized and also not typically calculated. And part of what we're looking to, again, is to come back to my beginning statement of thinking about we are on a planet in outer space circling a sun where there's a lot of free energy that we're not making intelligent use of. And that free energy is when the sun rises and sets, are we growing a diversity of plants on a farm? Are we raising a complexity of organisms that provide us with a high degree of beneficial yields throughout the entire growing season? And when the rain falls, are we catching it and holding it and storing it and doing something beneficial with it? Here's one of the larger systems that we installed recently. Here we are back in the Hudson River watershed. This is about a 2,100 gallon tank. And we also, in addition to paying attention to rainwater in this design, approached overall the layout of the beds again to be a rainwater catchment system that decreases runoff, decreases flooding, increases soil saturation, and cuts down on your need to irrigate nice, highly potent food providing crops. We also train people in these systems and show them specifically how do you develop a farm that is human scale, that uses local resources like local compost and the right tool for the right job. And really hamming it up with some of my students here to show exactly the importance to me of giving more people the actual hands-on knowledge that they need to become food independent and become energy independent and have fun collaborating together, achieving a higher degree of autonomy and a higher quality of life. And a lot of these crops, when you look at this, is another farm that we established on a property that is a small organic farm. And what we're looking at are things like winter squash, daikon, turnips. These are all crops that not a single drop of irrigation had to be added to. And they're crops that provided a very high degree of income benefit because we could turn them into fermented foods. We could store them in underground root cellars for a nice degree of food security in the wintertime, in particular the winter squash. But the daikon and the turnips went into kimchis that we made. Here's another operation that gives us a sense of how do we go about becoming food independent. This is a no-till tractor farm on 4 acres that estimates by the grower, Jay Moser, that they make somewhere in the neighborhood of $160,000 to $200,000 a year. And they're a NOFA certified facility, which is the Northeast Organic Farming Association. One of the really rich opportunities when we begin to scale up this question of food independence and energy independence is a missed opportunity when we look at many of the pre-existing studies. So here we're looking at a study from Scenic Hudson, and you can see this tendency within farm analysis of how much food could we grow within 100 miles of New York City to say, well, we can only grow it right along the Rondout River, when in fact we can grow vast amounts of food in other parts of Ulster County. There's also a huge amount of waste that's going on in the present system. It's estimated that 1/3 of all food in the US is wasted, is actually destroyed, lost, mishandled, damaged before anybody even gets to eat it. So there is a lot of opportunity to improve our capacity to become food independent by tapping into this wasted food to produce compost, which enables us to grow in places other than prime agricultural soils, because then we can take that compost from the 1/3 of wasted food and grow in places that are less than prime, less than ideal. And as we zoom in on the Rondout and begin to say, well, given that most studies are saying approximately we need a little less than 2 acres per person, how much food independence can we achieve within the Rondout drainage? And it is clearly achievable to grow all the food for all the people within the Rondout drainage, because we're looking at only needing 118,000 of the 719,000 acres to produce full diet year-round food consumption. When we begin to pan out and say, well, broader landscape mosaic, what are some of the ideas that we're talking about? Involve stepping out vulnerable settlements from the floodplain of main river drainages and conserving them and turning them into a kind of orchard that produces benefits for the brook trout and the brown trout, and children and families who are canoeing can begin to be harvesting both wild caught fish as well as heart nut, bort nut, Japanese walnut, pecans, to just name a few, in addition to the old classics like apples and cherries and pears, combined with sycamore and American beech and oak. Here's a design that we did to show how do we begin to do this on a particular property. This is in the Rondout drainage. This was a farm stand that had been put up for sale that we did some analysis of and came up with recommendations for extending the buffer with nut trees, planting out blueberries, having row crops of carrots and garlic and onions that then we could store in root cellars and make kimchi from and make sauerkraut from, as well as raspberries and greenhouses and a retail space and an event space, so that we begin to look at land as something that we need to diversify and create more eco-complexity, as well as benefits for flooding and river water quality. Again, we'll find many organizations that all agree that the Hudson River watershed is a thriving opportunity to begin to create more entrepreneurial endeavors to generate income through food production. So the potential for just beginning to tap into the financials that are estimated for food consumption in the tri-state area is a number somewhere in the neighborhood of $860 million that is looking to be spent within the tri-state area for local organic food, and right now is not finding any opportunity to do so. Tap into this massive thermonuclear furnace that's 93 million miles away, pouring vast quantities of energy over the earth every day, rather than depending upon all these ground extracted rare materials like uranium and petroleum. When we look at the numbers to go energy independent, we'll see that we create a vast array of jobs. Here we're looking at some numbers that Stanford University generated, and they estimate that the number of jobs that we'll generate by going 100% renewable is about 52 million jobs that will be created as we transition the US economy from being a fossil fuel and nuclear energy hog with a crazy array of pollution legacies, rather creating an energy system that uses offshore wind, uses tidal power, uses biogas, uses solar thermal, as well as photovoltaic. In China, 600,000 people work in a passive solar hot water system that right now we will be advocating as part of what we bring to the Rondout and we bring to the Hudson watershed. And in China, this passive solar thermal hot water technology provides all the hot water for a third of all the homes in China. This enabled the Chinese population to offset the need to build 40 nuclear nightmares. Here we're looking at Burlington, Vermont, which uses these biogas digesters. So as people enjoy conviviality and good beer, they can also provide all of the electricity that 42,000 citizens in Burlington need with a combination of biogas digesters, a series of large wind turbines on Georgia Mountain, a massive array of solar panels at the airport, as well as a wood chip to steam plant called the McNeil Station. The Magic App Brewery in Vermont makes good beer and provides energy and compost from their wastewater. A biogas fueled electric generator in Staten Island actually powers 20,000 homes in Staten Island. Thus, the city of New York makes $23 million off of the Fresh Kills landfill, taking the methane and powering a generator from it, that then they sell back the electricity to 20,000 homes within Staten Island. And no nuclear power plant in the entire country has ever made a profit because they cost so much to build. And then when you're done generating electricity, done making hot water, you've still got biosolids that you can make excellent fertilizer with. And again, it's important for us to celebrate our humanity, celebrate our natural bodily processes, rather than thinking that it is somehow a detriment to the earth that people need to do things like go to the bathroom and take showers, when in fact in a city of New York City size, like 8.5 million people to 20 million people, we need to begin to get creative about what we're doing with sewage so that it becomes a resource rather than part of the 24 billion gallons of combined sewer overflows that we have. In China, these biogas plants right now power 40 million homes. The goal in China is to power the equivalent of over 3/4 of the United States population off of a technology that is barely developed within this country. And this is an exciting opportunity and a key part of the node of how we go energy independent. We're going to incorporate the most cutting edge systems that rely on some of the most ancient aspects of life, which are microbes and plants, to digest black water and nutrient streams so that we can integrate biogas digesters with living machines. When we combine these two, we have a biodigester at the beginning, and that will take all the solids, and then after that we'll send it to a living machine to polish and finish cleaning the water and provide cut flowers and nature connection in the wintertime. In Calcutta, we have something like 26,000 people employed just processing compost. We want to combine electrical generation with hot water, with ecological systems that are going to provide honey, that are going to provide beauty, and that are going to cut down on the need for the building to be using energy to stay cool in the summertime and to stay warm in the wintertime. It turns out that in fact when we look at renewables, that when we combine living roofs and green roofs with photovoltaic systems and solar thermal systems, we actually get better performance in these because they get too hot on a conventional roof. And in fact, we can add to that and have some beehives in the mix and add pollinator habitat in addition to solving environmental problems with green roofs in high density urban environments. And this is about a vision that connects cities to countries, that helps regions to become more self-reliant for energy and for food, beginning to map out areas that can be interconnected, where we create flyways, where we create natural pollinator corridors, where we create bike trails and connectivity. Also paying attention to plans of pre-existing zoning code and municipalities. This is from a comprehensive plan done in the village of Ellenville. And many of the ideas that we've suggested dovetail purposefully with this existing plan that is already on paper saying they want to go more food independent. They want to begin to create a place in the village where people can enjoy nature and have some connection with it. And here we're laying out a prospectus for how could we revitalize Ellenville with a arts and community center, a food co-op and satellite store and cafe, a commercial municipal compost facility, and a Ulster County Green Tech training facility that would enable people to learn all these different skills about natural building, solar thermal hot water, biogas digesters, which are key to taking many of those 1/3 food waste materials and turning them into a resource. And understanding where we are and that there are rich opportunities to increase nature connection by daylighting streams and waterways. One of the projects we're working on right now is actually from Avenue B down East 8th Street to D. And what we're doing is looking at places where we could daylight this waterway and rallying local public opinion in the Lower East Side around creating opportunities like this within New York, rather than an opportunity that doesn't exist at present, as far as some place where people can go and touch the water that isn't polluted. Where are we going to place all this green infrastructure in New York City? The biogas digesters, the solar thermal arrays, the photovoltaic facilities, the compost facilities, the green job training centers. Well, much of it we can build on what are considered to be brownfields, which are places that are not nearly as polluted as a Superfund or a more highly toxic site. They need some mitigation and remediation. And there's over 4,000 acres of them on 6,000 parcels. The perfect place for the green infrastructure that we want to establish here. We want to reforest along rivers and waterways. We want to create a national economy that's made up of local bioregional economies where regions are able to become more food independent and energy independent, and then have excesses of really high quality local products that they can share and export as value-added products to one another. Cheese coming from the Northeast, oranges coming from Florida, wine coming from the Pacific Northwest, grazing animals and beef coming from the Midwest. Each region will have unique crops, buildings, and energy systems that are designed and engineered to be well adapted to each geographic area of the country. We get much higher benefits from beginning to adapt. How are we building buildings? What types of crops are we growing where? How are we engineering things to be more adapted to where we're actually building them and installing them? Farms, energy, towns, and infrastructure. Because at present, we're vulnerable, we're held hostage, we're very food insecure, we have many food deserts, we have a lot of Americans who don't feel that they have access to the basic necessities of life. And this is about providing high quality, healthy food for all, as well as energy autonomy and jobs with integrity. And landing back into our local subwatershed of the Rondout and going food independent, energy independent, will create a diversity of green jobs. Keep a planetary perspective so we appreciate the true scale of our existence, and design for our cosmic inheritance. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And so fascinating. Design for a cosmic inheritance. I love that phrase.
Thank you.
We're going to let people, ask questions, and please, if you have some, just drop it in the chat box here. But, one of the things that I want to ask you is, very often, every time I touch into permaculture or I start exploring it and I go into it, I can get a little bit overwhelmed by, all what needs to change, from the food, the water, the energy, the building, the waste. There's so many aspects to it. And here, obviously you show a beautiful comprehensive plan for potentially farm or a bigger piece of land around a big cities. But I'm wondering if you could kind of narrow it down, or maybe put in this kind of order, if there's any order to it for individuals, people maybe that have a house or a small land or a small farm, or looking to build a community center or something like that. Where do we start, and what is the most effective way to kind of roll out a plan, and what to look for when we're doing that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. The simplest answer, and I think the most useful one that I can give, is to say that when you focus on water, and if you get everything right in regards to water, then other things are going to fall into place with what the goals are of your design objectives. If you don't get water right, then pretty much everything else you're going to be trying to do is going to have some difficulties in being achievable. So to me, the first thing to focus on is, how do you have what in permaculture design we have these principles, which are very useful because the principles give you a checklist of things to be measuring what you're focusing on and how well a job you're doing at achieving what you're trying to achieve. And so one of those principles is multiple backups for a single essential function. A multiple backup would mean, for water, do you have a couple places that you could have potable water available on a property should the grid go out? Do you have a water filter? Do you have a water pump? Do you have some kind of above surface water feature that you could go and gather water from, that then you could put through a filter and then it would be potable? So potable water, because if you think about human beings, I mean, short of us suddenly having our air deprived for some reason, which is less likely than becoming severely dehydrated or getting a bacterial sickness because of drinking polluted water, right? So water is the fundamental bottom line for human health and well-being. When you actually, you think about, Americans are largely vastly dehydrated. And then we're also, if you think about, if you went back to the 80s, nobody would have believed that you were going to be making billions of dollars off of bottled water. Right? But the bottled water industry has just exploded, right? So, and the reason for that is because of the psychology of human beings, is that we want to be sure that we've got a known entity when it comes to water. So in terms of homestead design, in terms of site design, the first thing to check off is water. And I think that's, I create the next thing I would say is staying warm in the wintertime, and thinking about how you're not going to freeze to death if your generator doesn't have propane or gas in it. A lot of people in the Northeast thought, like, well, post a hurricane or a natural disaster, you suddenly saw a spike in sales of generators, right? Because that was the solution for Northeastern suburbanites and country dwellers to energy insecurity, was generators. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, a generator is just a Band-Aid technology, because it obviously requires that somehow you're going to get propane, diesel, or gasoline to your property so the generator can keep running, right? But let's imagine a scenario where the power stays out long enough that you run out of fuel for your generator. Now, how are you staying comfortable in your house? So thinking about heat in the wintertime is key in a rural environment. In an urban, so I think there's tiers of what those goals are going to be for a city dweller is slightly different than what they're going to be for a suburbanite, which is slightly different than what they're going to be for remote rural dweller, right? Which are kind of the three layers that I recommend considering yourself probably nested within one of those layers. You're probably either living in an urban infrastructure, or you're living in a suburban infrastructure, or you're living in a remote rural infrastructure, right? And what the answer is, what the solution is, what the means are to a better level of security and quality of life in the city is different than what it is in the burbs, is different than what it is in the country, but not that different. I don't know, is that helpful, folks?
It does. And I remember, you know, when we were discussing together, I was thinking about energy. And so heat in general, you know, is really important. And then we get warm. And I think you said something about wood being one of the most ecological way to heat a house, using wood, if I remember, or maybe it was wood pellets or things like that. And could you
Absolutely.
expand a little bit on that, on the really
Sure.
the most ecological way to heat, and maybe talking about electricity too, and our needs in electricity, because we have just so many electric needs also now?
So, yeah, that's a great question. I'll say a couple things about it to kind of, this is just so folks understand, I teach an entire 72-hour course on what we're going to try to synopsize into like a couple like minutes here of conversation. So I'll try to take my fire hose and funnel it down for you into something that like doesn't blow you off the charts, but like is like, all right, what the heck is. So with that being said, there's a couple of different things to say. One is that in the country and in the burbs, I think wood heat can make a lot of good sense. You get into high density urban environments, I'm not suggesting we're doing a lot with wood. What we might be doing with wood in a place like, you notice in the film, one of the analogies that I could have gone a little further into was Burlington. Okay, I love taking Burlington as a case study, right? So this idea of a case study, are folks with me on what I mean by that? Right, so a case study is we're going to take something that's pretty analogous to some other set of circumstances, and then we can basically take that information and we can transpose it onto that other circumstance, right? And so the reason why I find Burlington compelling, multiple reasons. One is I like Burlington. It's a cool place to hang out for sure, even though it's like so like just ubiquitously, frighteningly, homogeneously white. I still like Burlington. I couldn't move to Vermont for that reason. Like every single town in Vermont, I love Vermonters. I've taught in Vermont for 14 years at Yes Tomorrow, right? But my wife is Latino and my daughter has Latin heritage. And for the idea of moving to Vermont was moving to a place where every single town is 96% white. Every single town, even Jamaica, Vermont, is nice. So I'm not disparaging that, but I want my child to grow up in a diverse environment. So Brooklyn, New York City, and Ellenville have both provided that diversity, that lifestyle-wise, values-wise, I really dig Vermont. So Burlington is 100% energy renewable. And the thing that's so smart about Burlington is that they did it in a way where they're grid independent. So if the grid gets a glitch in it in the Northeastern Corridor, Burlington is running scot-free and happy with their renewable infrastructure powering their entire grid. And the McNeil steamed power plant gets all their steam from wood chips that they grow from 30 acres of a coppicing willow lot that they planted that supplies them with fuel in perpetuity. Burlington is also 42,400 people. Poughkeepsie, 32,700 people. Kingston, 28,800 people. In other words, quick math tells us if Burlington can do it, in Vermont too, right? Like think about this. They're at a farther northern latitude. When we're talking about renewables, that inherently means everything is constrained into a smaller funnel of opportunity to get an energy yield, because you're farther north on a planet that's 24,901 miles in circumference. And that's why I find latitude and longitude to be super useful, right? They're like empirical ways to say, what's your average length of day? How many Sundays do you get? And what's your solar income? Right? Like I like to say, you know, physics, biology, ecology, evolution, those things are empirical, they're objective, they're measurable. If you want to get into like subjective, like totally nefarious ways to talk about reality, I can't be bothered with that. Because what I like about permaculture is it says, you know what is real? Physics is real. Chemistry is real. Geology is real. And when we may have used Western science to disenfranchise indigenous peoples around the world, which I absolutely acknowledge, along with people like Vandana Shiva, who talks and is one of my main influencers when it comes to thinking about how do we ethically and morally with integrity actually have science not be something that disenfranchises matriarchal societies, indigenous societies, and societies that have basically been domineered by Western science technocrats, right? So I understand the catch-22 of science, I think, pretty well. And what's important to understand about it is that it's a tool, and it's a very powerful tool. And we want to avail ourselves of the use of that tool. Because that tool, unfortunately, to use a quick metaphor, that's the tool that split the atom. That's the tool that created the atomic bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And anybody who wants to doubt the power of Western science is doubting the power of the entire technocratic military industrial complex, because it is founded on Western science. And that is not my way of saying that anything that they did with that power was ethically or morally positive. Obviously, it wasn't 100% ethically and morally culpable. So I like science. I like being empirical. And when we think about a place like Burlington and we say, does Burlington offer us a lesson that we could quickly transpose onto a place like Kingston? It absolutely does. And when people try to say, well, burning wood is a bad idea, and you can actually point to an urban system that has actually planted trees that supply all the wood heat for a good portion of their energy grid. And they're doing this method that comes from Europe that's called coppicing, where they basically, instead of cutting down wild trees, right, they planted a wood lot. And then they perpetually harvest that wood lot in order to provide steam that then powers a generator. Like I mentioned in the film, the Fresh Kills landfill takes the methane from Fresh Kills and provides electricity for 20,000 homes in Staten Island. Now, I'm not trying to rationalize landfills in that statement and say, oh, well, landfills are okay because maybe we can power homes next. No. But what I'm getting at is that we live in a country where we're so addicted to subsidized petrochemical and radioactive materials that we don't even have a notion of what's a rational, energetic decision when it comes to how we heat our homes. We're completely so bonkers off the charts in this country in terms of doing something that's rational or reasonable or appropriate when it comes to how we produce heat. You know, like when you think about the fact that there's 8.5 million people to 20 million people living, 8.5 million people in New York City is where the subway delivers to. 20 million people is what's technically defined as the greater metropolitan area of New York City, right? So if we take the whole of New York City, if we take the whole Northeastern corridor, that's 120 million people. It's over a third of the US population. Now, if we say like, well, how should we heat a city? That's where we get into these biodigesters. Because biodigesters, we're talking about 3,380 tons a day that get trucked out of New York City and landfilled, right? So every single day, there's 3,380 tons of food scraps that are leaving New York City on tractor trailer trucks combined with trash and ending up in landfills, right? And that's why the landfills create methane. But imagine you actually had jobs where people got the food scraps out of the trash because you already told the people who generated the food scraps that they had to put it all in buckets, and you made a law about it. And you said everybody who produces food scraps in New York City, who's a restaurant and a grocery store and a cafeteria and a school, You all have to start right now putting your food scraps in a separate cubicle that we're going to give you, that the city of New York is going to issue to everybody who produces large volumes of food scraps. Then you mandate and you create a tax incentive for entrepreneurial business enterprises that do curbside pickup of large producers of organic food scraps first, right? And you do this scaled up approach where you first say all the largest, worst actors who generate the highest volumes of food waste, you're going to be the ones that we mandate first to divert it from the waste stream. And then we're going to create a tax incentive for micro enterprises and entrepreneurial businesses that will actually take those food scraps and create either compost and soil or send them to a biogas digester. What biodigesters do is then they take the methane and they use that methane to run a hot water heater or to run a generator. And so then what you can do is you can be basically heating buildings throughout the 5 boroughs with biodigesters as we create the decentralized power grid of New York City. So right technology for the right place, right? A municipal scale biodigester to heat a building isn't going to make as much sense in a place where there's a lot of distance between the residential dwellings like the burbs or the country, right? But when you get into dwellings that are further apart from one another and you're in a northeastern temperate ecology where trees grow as abundantly as they do, then wood starts to make more sense. Solar thermal hot water. As I mentioned in the film, 600,000 people in China have a full-time job doing nothing but making a technology that we still barely even understand in this country. I sell it to give you a sense of what's so fascinating about the work that I do. I sell this technology to clients and they've never even heard of it, and it's going to cost them $10,000 to have it put in their house. They still buy it after I spend a while explaining to them what it is. I don't make any money off of it. I subcontract it to a separate engineer. Why am I bothering to sell people on this technology? Because it sets an example of something that's an inherently better idea. Solar thermal is passive. It is an evacuated glass tube that creates hot water by virtue of just what the tube does. It's not creating an electrical current that then goes to a device that then does the heating for you. So when you create hot water with a photovoltaic panel, you're using electricity to power an on-demand hot water heater, which, just as a side note, is an insane decision because you now have to run a separate devoted line to an on-demand hot water heater because it's going to take 220 to run an on-demand electric hot water heater. Bad design concept, on-demand electric. I'm not saying that if you have it, rip it out of your house, but what I'm getting at is that right technology for the right job is still not even part of the lexicon of what we're seeing happening with renewables in this country, right? We've still got a very generic, a very industrial, a very contractor-driven renewable energy sector in the Northeastern United States. So instead of finesse, instead of diversity, you've got homogeneity, ubiquity, and industrial mindsets driving the renewable agenda. Right, which is being written by people like Scenic Hudson. You know, Scenic Hudson wrote a document called Accelerating Large-Scale Wind and Solar. Well, in writing I've been doing about this, I've been saying, you know, that title speaks for itself. Accelerating large-scale wind and solar. Maybe we should, rather than accelerating it, have a public participation comment period where we discuss it. I'm not just buying into the notion that the goal to solve climate change is to suddenly have 500-acre solar arrays in Copake, New York, and clear cutting our ridgelines and throwing up giant wind farms on them. But what you will find is that many do-gooders in the climate change sector are actually rabidly, aggressively wanting to roll out renewables to a fault, to where they don't want to hear any criticism. And if you criticize it, you're a NIMBY. Right. So like I had people on, there's a whole entity that the state of New York called, they're called the Office for Renewable Energy Siting. And the Office for Renewable Energy Siting doesn't even come into a conversation unless you're trying to do a 20-acre, 500 megawatt array. So they basically want to do huge photovoltaic arrays and run everything off of electric. So that's why I'm speaking to that, because running everything off of electric is not the most ecological, nor the most appropriate, nor the most resilient way to be doing things.
So, I want to open for people. If anyone has a question, I have so many other questions. I think one of the subjects you were kind of touching upon a little bit, it seems to me that there's definitely a social and political implication way beyond just climate change, beyond energy use, beyond how do we want to live together. And it seems to me that it's almost like the fighting of two very different way of living together. Like it's not just permaculture here. It's not just how do we harvest energy, but there's kind of a way where diversity almost on the land and the way we would bring back diversity on how we eat and local imply diversity of people, implies diversity and community and discussions like you just mentioned, and it seems to me that those ideas somehow require not only education, but really a change of political mindset. Mm-hmm. Because the whole empire of industrial complex with oil and gas and nuclear and all that is predominantly, white male dominated colonizing kind of mind. I mean, I'm kind of pushing into an extreme, but it's pretty much what it looks like to me. Mm-hmm. In many ways. Mm-hmm. And as we don't take care of the land, obviously we don't take care of the people, and as we unify land, we want kind of unified people. So I'm sure it's a long discussion on that, but it's one of the things. I don't know if you want to touch a little bit upon that, but if anyone else has a question, please just raise your hands or unmute yourself. If you are working on a project, or if you have questions or things that you have seen even in your community and things that you want to share or personal experience, I'd love to hear also some other experience there. Yes, Kevin, I can unmute you here. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Hello.
If you want to introduce yourself, Kevin, because I know you, but it'd be great for people to know who you are.
Oh, sure. My name is Kevin Martin. I'm a Hunktawan. I'm a Yankton Sioux from the Fort Peck Reservation. I live on the Navajo Reservation, and I'm currently working on a project down here to forward permaculture and regenerative energy to the Navajo Nation, and actually setting a template to be used throughout the United States. Having said that, I do understand that the changing needs of each reservation in its own biome. But for over here in the reservation systems, with the advent of climate change getting hotter, most of the crops are burning on the surface, and most of it is corn crops. There's a lot of native technology or native techniques, particularly the Hopi, for planting in regions such as this. Water sequestration is of huge import, and to bring to bear some of these best practices in permaculture for such a degraded land, we're trying to do a multiple approach. Like John DeLu, he's offered his services over here to put up another ecological restoration system, etc. I guess my question to you would be is, we have a river here, and it was just so happened to be the one that Gold King Mine spilled on, and frightened people away. A lot of people in this region are really depending on that river to grow crops, and it's huge amongst the Dene people, because then they take that corn and store it. Do you know of any kind of water? I mean, something on Chinampas, something on that scale that could be utilized in the riverbeds without having to impact studies, because that's what's stopping everything right now. Do you know of anybody that's done that?
I'm not sure if I understand the context of the question. A chinampas in a river?
Yeah, and the reason I'm saying that is because, looking at some of the capabilities of cattails to sequester heavy metal, looking at doing multi-purpose systems on.
I see. I think I understand. You're talking about for bioremediation because
right,
water polluted.
Right, and
what's it contaminated with? broadly?
You name it. There's fracking systems all in and above on the watersheds above that region. There's pollution from a NAPI, which is a non-GMO, or it's a GMO crops with glycophosphates.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, pretty much a sewer, seriously. So we're taking a look at water remediation and cleansing. And I didn't know about clams. You know, I had seen clams prior to, and chinampas for growing biomass for crops and actually setting some crops down. And then doing little projects like walapinis and for, you know, and doing sand dams and you know, all kinds.
I mean, I think those things make some sense, but I would also wonder if you're legally allowed to pump water out of the river, because usually the USDA will let farmers pump 10,000 gallons a day without a permit. And if you were to pump more than that, they'd say you need a permit. But if you were to do something even close to that volume, then I would send it to some kind of bioremediation planting, plus doing stuff if you can in the river. But I think you'll actually get more ability to control and concentrate what you're doing with your cleaning plantings if you do them outside of the riverbed itself. So if you're able to actually like pump river water and then create a vegetated channel that you sent that river water to, now you'd have a more controlled circumstance where you could know that you were actually doing a pretty thorough job of filtering what you then used after it came out of that planting bed. You know, and you could create like an intentional wetland bioremediation planting that you sent river water through that you pumped to that planting. And if you could, messing around in the river itself, but like you said, you might, I don't know how regulated or monitored the river is. That might be the kind of thing you'd get more guff for, is if you actually started trying to do plantings right in the main stem of the river. Depending on the regulatory agencies and how much scrutiny they're giving, they're actually more likely to give you a hard time about that than they are about you pumping the river water to something else where you do that. That's one thing.
The real critical component as well. Well noted. So, you know, the projects that we're looking to scale on the Navajo reservation, they're multiple, they're large, and we've got fairly decent support. Looking for any and all kinds of recommendations, and as far as companies willing to stage with us to make that presentation.
Well, you know, so I'm going to put my name in the, I'm going to put my email in
I can introduce you. I'll make a separate email intro, Andrew, and Kevin. I will introduce you. Yeah.
I'm just going to say something a little sassy here. I actually know a lot more than John DeLu, and I will definitely give you free advice. I've hosted him in Brooklyn. I like John. I like the work he's doing. I think he's good at bringing people power to you. He does not have the design sensor skills or experience or background that I do. And that's not an egotistical statement. It's just an accurate comparison as far as resources that you'd have, you know? I would welcome a further conversation where we can go deeper into some of these details for you that we don't have time tonight to get into.
You bet. And thank you very much for your attention, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I'll make an intro separated from that. So wondering if anyone has questions or thoughts on what's being shared. Maybe raise your hand.
Anybody else just want to jump in? Questions, comments, feedback, as I always say in my classes. Folks, I'm going to say I have a class starting February 6th online. I'd highly recommend it. If you enjoy this film and you want to get a little deeper into it, or a lot deeper, it's 11 sessions that are 6 hours long, and they're all live, and you then have them all as Zoom recordings that you can download. And
yeah, someone else was asking about accessing further education on that, and maybe Andrew, you can send me some links about that, and I'll do a follow-up email with a recording of the class to, we had like 70 or 80 people signing up, so I'll send that in a recap email. With some additional resources and also the recording. Perfect. And your contact, Andrew, here. And just so you know, Andrew has been coming here on the land of the sanctuary, and we're looking to do some things here with him. So I'm quite excited about that. So before we close, I'm mindful of the time. Can you just, I know maybe it was an elevated question, but can you talk about this context I talked about between the political and the system we are in, which have obviously huge forces at play, with huge investment already in place in the fossil fuel industry and all of that. And sometimes it can feel like us as individuals or as smaller communities don't have that much power to influence. Maybe we can do something on our land and in our town, or sorry, with our house. But how do we really bring that change beyond that? What can we do on the local level? Maybe how can we really get local people that most of the time actually have no education on it, I've never heard about the systems and don't even know what's possible. How can we get that movement which you've been trying to build for a long time, Andrew? And what is the thing that each and every one of us can do? Or is it just doing things for us right now, just in our home, and already kind of starting the change there?
Mm-hmm. So let me just ask, does anybody else who's here tonight have a question or something else, and I can fold in my answer with anybody else's queries that may be out there? I see a lot of still faces, not many people on video. That's fine. Just wondering if there's anybody else who wants to check in.
It's Craig. I think Craig has a question. If you can unmute yourself.
Craig's a graduate. He doesn't get to ask. I'm just kidding. Totally
I was just gonna say a little
good to see you, man.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Andrew. It's been a little while. Yeah, I was just gonna say I took a class and it was incredible. If anybody's thinking about it, it absolutely blew my mind. I think Andrew speaks for himself. And his passion, but he's an incredible teacher, and I learned so much. And I'm sure everyone here shares in some sense the recognition of what needs to happen. And I feel like I was given, the theoretical background, but also like real tools that I feel like I'm applying. And so I couldn't, recommend it more highly. So, and it's great to see everybody. And Andrew, I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Craig. Thanks so much.
So Paul is asking, how do we make change on a regional scale? And what's the best way to make
another graduate. These graduates aren't.
It's just like you haven't answered that in the class.
Yeah, I guess not. We didn't just watch a 30-minute film, Paul, did we? For me, the regional scale thing, I start making the people on your town board feel watched. Show up at town planning meetings. Show up at participatory budget meetings in Brooklyn. Show up at the Solid Waste Authority board meetings like my graduates in Brooklyn have started doing to advocate for composting initiatives, right? We just need to step up as civil participants in the civic sector. Stop getting on nonprofit boards. Stop volunteering for things that, really, or do both and. I'm joking, right? In permaculture, we love both and, meaning whatever you're already doing, continue doing it, plus try to add something new to the list. Like Town of Wawarsing, where I am, on their website, they have Zoom links to the town meeting, right? So I've been starting to go to those and watching what they're doing and how they're running their meetings and what they're talking about. And then eventually I get on their agenda and I start to proselytize my own agenda, which is that they start to think about growing more food for the town of Wawarsing in the town of Wawarsing, right? So you kind of pick a thing that you really care about and that you're passionate about and get involved in it locally. One of the things we're really involved in right now is food insecurity in Ellenville. Which is a very real thing. There's a lot of hunger in Ellenville. There's a lot of people who are in real need, who, whenever we can, we're collaborating with people to get food to people who need food. We participate with a group called the Family of Ellenville that does stuff to get food to families who are really in need. I think getting involved in our civic structures that already exist is important, so that then we kind of get a sense of like, who are our allies, what's the playing field, and who is interested in starting to work on some ideas about how we become more food secure locally. So with the regional plan thing, to me, food is the thing to keep kind of blowing the horn of. And then, because I've been finding that food ends up butting heads right now, I've been having just as my own personal experience of my pursuits of this, there's a lot of conflict right now happening between renewable energy initiatives and food, because there's more interest in throwing up solar arrays all over the place than there is in thinking about making sure we're going to be able to have what I like to describe as year-round, full diet food supply in a given area. And if you start covering over really good farm soils with solar panels, well, you may be able to graze some cattle there. You may be able to grow some wildflowers and grasses. You are not going to be able to grow potatoes. And the reality is that there are only some soils that are good for potatoes. There are a lot more soils that are good for grazing cattle and growing wildflowers and grasses. What you want to be careful of is that you don't just plop and drop solar arrays on what are actually good potato growing, corn growing, root crop growing soils. Throughout Ulster County, throughout Dutchess County, throughout Columbia County, throughout the Hudson watershed, we have an excess of ridgy, rocky, wet grazing land, maybe dairy land. This is why this part of the country back in the 1800s was largely dairy, was because not a lot of it is really good for growing carrots or for growing wheat or for growing corn or for growing potatoes. Some of it is, but what's happened is over the last 70 to 100 years, we're living in an industrial economy that has started to treat all soils fairly uniformly. So that when you get into chemical industrial agriculture that's subsidized in the Rondout watershed, in the Hudson watershed, which is still, and a lot of people who aren't close enough to growing, which I've done a lot of growing organic vegetables. I'll be speaking actually at the NOFA. Are folks familiar with NOFA? So NOFA is the Northeast Organic Farming Association. So again, when we think about regional, who are our allies? Well, a farming organization like the Northeast Farming NOFA is an important part of your regional network, because growers who grow organically are a crowd that is already starting to think more creatively about what do we need to do in order to create more food security and increase our quality of life here, right? They want to continue to have a livelihood being a grower. They want to bring more abundance to people's lives, and they want to collaboratively brainstorm about how to do a better job at being a farmer, being a gardener. So advocating for local organic produce, that is full diet year round as a master plan for land use patterns becomes something that can begin to change patterns of development, which is what I'm keen on, is creating drawings, maps, master plans that we can actually take to planning board meetings and advocate for and say, here's what it would look like to grow more of the potatoes for the Rondout watershed population. Here's where we need to protect land to make sure we don't throw up a bunch of solar panels on it.
Makes sense. So I saw one last question. I think Mary had a question. Mary, if you want to ask it. And then Caitlin was asking, what are your thoughts, Andrew, about CSA and their effectiveness? But
oh, sure. That's a great question.
Is Mary still there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. It's been great. Thank you so much. We are a number of us here are trying to oppose a big plan to destroy the East River Park in New York City. I know you are a resident of New York City.
Yeah.
Part of this plan to destroy 1,000 trees and put landfill 8 feet or 10 feet of landfill over 53 or 57 acres of land in the East River, along the East River in New York City. Part of that is also eliminating one of the biggest and most successful organic community compost station. And we are trying to fight that. There is a great ecological center that has done a ton of work with the community around there, educating the community, making this park more resilient to stormwater, etc. And all this work is going to be destroyed in the months to come and for years to come. So there's the compost issue. The park department considers that compost should not be part of parks. They hate compost. They think it's dirty or something. And then there is this crazy $1.5 billion plan to destroy this whole this whole ecosystem that is the East River Park, which is just as big as the Central Park in New York City or close to that, second to that. So really, we need help. We need advice. We're many, but yeah. Can we work together on a plan to propose to the Planning Commission of New York City of what it would look like to have, a real composting strategy that that works with the communities along the East River that are Black and brown and poor, etc. And can we have a real review of this plan to make it resilient? An environmental impact review or something that would help us defeat that current plan. I'm sure you've heard about it.
I mean, I would imagine you already have a consortium of community activists down there that are rallying around this. Is that correct?
Yes, we do. We have rallied a large group of people that are pretty committed. But sometimes we feel like we lack the technicity, the political, urbanistic, ecological solutions to oppose the city and convince and feel legitimate, and also to get the media to be with us, because they're super good at saying, oh, well, it's flood protection. Don't you want to be protected from Sandy? You want another Sandy catastrophe? So it's a difficult dialogue.
I got you. It's part of some seawall concept.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
That's a tough one.
No environment.
Well, yeah. So a couple things I'd say. First of all, I bet some of the people you already have who are part of your coalition know more about this than I do. But what I will say, my 2 cents on it. How about Grow NYC? Are they part of your consortium at all? Grow NYC? Do you know them?
Community gardeners are.
Green Thumb is, the community gardens are part of it. Grow NYC is not.
The Grow NYC is worth reaching out to because they're a city agency. So if they align with you, they're a little bit more of like a transition. Green Thumbs is a little bit more independent and just oversees the community gardens. Here's another potential ally, Trust for Public Lands.
Okay.
Or Bette Midler, the New York Restoration Project, NYRP. You know NYRP?
Bette Midler supports us.
Bette Midler supports us.
Supports you? Okay, great. How about the Lower East Side Ecology Center?
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
They're the ones being displaced. They're being evicted.
They're being evicted. Okay. How about Wendy Brower and Green Maps NYC?
She's with us.
She's with us.
And she doesn't. I mean, she's trying as hard as she can, but no environmentalists have reviewed this. It's all been reviewed by engineers and hydrologists.
How about Paul Mankiewicz and Gaia Institute?
I'm taking note of those. Thank you.
Paul's a good friend. Paul knows Wendy, and Paul and I and Dee Dee Mocker. You probably know Dee Dee. Do you know Dee Dee?
No, doesn't ring a bell.
But Dee Dee's been doing a lot with friends of mine who have a space called the Gray Space that's on 12th. she's been doing permaculture classes, ecological design classes. I'll send you, let me send you my email.
I'll put that in the recap email for everybody because there's
Okay,
one
good. So you
question.
can-
Yeah.
Great. So you can just send me an email and I'll send you a link to Dee Dee's stuff. But you know, short version, what I would say, and we could spend, this is certainly an important topic, but I would say that finding a landscape architect who could do some good drawings for you of what you would like to do versus what they want to do. You know, it may sound superficial, but honestly, some good design drawings that show why what you're talking about is a better idea than what they want to do could help with making a case for it. Plus connecting with, you know, Bette Midler and NYRP is a good ally, but another one to look to is Trust for Public Lands, because if it wasn't for Trust for Public Lands and NYRP, there would basically be no community gardens in New York City, because Giuliani wanted to auction them all off to developers in the 80s, right? So they went from 2,000 to 600. And the reason why there's only 600 is because of Trust for Public Lands and NYRP. And then what happened was the city felt like they had egg on their face. So then Green Thumbs and Parks Department started to take responsibility for some of the acreage that actually had only been protected by Trust for Public Lands and NYRP. So they're two of the heavyweights when it comes to stepping in for community groups and actually bringing in money to help people protect real estate. Also, there might be there's a Manhattan Land Trust. The Manhattan Land Trust has a conservation easement over the 6th Street Community Center. In the 6th Street between B and C, 6th Street Community Center, Howard. You know, Howard's a good friend and an ally of ours. Howard might be another important networking resource for you. He's the director of the 6th Street Community Center. Because they put an easement on 6th Street that permanently sold the air rights so that it could never be developed, which depreciated their real estate sizably so that their taxes are very low. Maybe there's a way too that you can come up with a combination plan where the city gets to do their seawall and the park gets to remain as well. You know, it's always worth exploring from a design perspective. Maybe there's a way to start to find some creative solutions that integrate the two ideas.
Well, thank you.
That's helpful.
Yeah, I hope that answer, Mary, at least that helped. Thank you, Andrew, for taking the time. So for everybody on the call here, I'm going to do a follow-up email tomorrow with some links to the Permaculture New York class that Andrew is starting on February 6th. That's online, so everybody can join that.
Highly recommend it. Just to chime in too, that
yes,
price,
please.
That price is going to go up next time we go back to live classes. So look at it as a rare opportunity to be able to get in on it for what it is right now. I can tell you it's usually a $900 to $1,000 course, and it's $600 right now.
Wonderful. So we'll also share the recording with you, and also how to contact Andrew if you want, to be in touch with them. And we're going to do some projects here on the land for those of you that are near the sanctuary or want to come by. We'll have some nice project coming up in spring when we can finally be outdoor and do some fun things together. So, that's what I love about permaculture. And I have to say that's how I met Andrew, and had so much fun doing weekend programs. And really, there's a lot of theory and wisdoms and books and things to read. But when we get our hands in the dirt and we make it happen, there's nothing more fun than that. I mean, at least for me.
Absolutely.
I really enjoy it.
Yeah, all of our graduates we mentor, and we teach you how to do stuff like plant trees, build structures, read the landscape. We spend a lot of time outside looking at different places and trying to understand what the history of them is. And then we teach you a lot about how to interpret that in different landscapes. And let me answer the person's question too. And if anybody else has some to throw in, feel free. But CSAs, I saw there on the chat thread, CSAs, community supported agriculture farms. I'm a big fan of them. Still one of the best websites is the Robin Van End Center. Robin Van N, EYN, Robin spelled ROBYN. Let me put that in here in the chat. That's what this is for. Great information resource about where all the CSAs are in your area. Oh, I misspelled that. Robin Van N, EYN. CSAs, I always used to joke, and I still think it's accurate to say they're a bit of a commie pinko plot to take farmers out of the situation where they are held hostage to a scenario where they don't get paid for the work they do till the end of the growing season. You know, the beauty of community supported agriculture is that the person who's going to be eating the food crop is paying for it up front. And that's a big deal because it totally changed the world for people who are growers from being in a situation where they're basically like going in debt, taking out loans. And this is part of how I just heard about this. Here's an interesting side note. The largest class action settlement case for the federal government to deal with a infringement and a discrimination case was $1 billion sold out to over 20,000 Black farmers in the South because of the way the USDA had been denying them farm loans for decades, right? So the whole reason why farmers get on this scenario where they have to get a loan every year and then hopefully pay it back at the end of the year is because there's no such thing as CSAs for growers who operate in that world, right? So most farmers go way into debt at the beginning of the season and then hopefully get out of it at the end of the season. The real beauty of the CSA is the shared risk, where the buyer is sharing the risk with the grower. And that is a much more balanced, equitable, and positive relationship to be in. I personally think that CSAs are something that are hugely important to the regional food movement. They're transformative and not necessarily where as a grower you're going to make the most money, right? So most growers I know who do shares in subscription farming and run a community supported agriculture operation usually also do a farmer's market and often also do restaurant sales, because what you'll find is that the price point per item for you as a grower is lower for the CSA subscriber than it is for a retail buyer at a farmer's market or at a restaurant. But what it is really great for is when you have these 3 different nodes of your business enterprise, now you've got your staple that covers everything at the beginning of the growing season, which are CSA shares. Then when you get into the growing season, you can start making a little more profit by having a farmer's market stand and selling to restaurants, right? So CSAs, very important. They have grown by upwards of numbers like 20% over a 3-year time period when the USDA tracked them from somewhere around, I want to say 2009 to 2014. They grew by 20% in like a 3 to 4 year time period. So they're one of this, and in some instances, over 200 new CSAs opened up in 1 year in Long Island. So they're absolutely a burgeoning, powerful, important change to the financial relationship between growers and buyers. And as a consumer who's looking for high quality organic produce, if you can find a community supported agriculture farm that would drop off or that you could go and pick up at, I highly recommend doing that before you feel like you have to grow all your own food for yourself. It's a lot easier to basically, first step is to become a conscious consumer and connect with local growers. Next step is producing what makes sense and what you feel like producing for yourself, right? But there's a lot of growers out there that are close at hand that would love to grow food for you. They're just waiting for you to connect with them, right? And the CSA network and that Robin Van N Center is a good place to start and just say, where's a CSA that's nearby that I could go? So is that helpful for the folks? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for taking the time to answer that.
Oh, my pleasure. As you can tell, I like talking about these things.
That's why we're here.
we're all pent up inside. So this is a great release valve for me. I'm used to having audiences of 20 to 30 people as a live show in New York City. So these are challenging times for a live performer like I am.
Yeah, exactly.
Craig.
Hey, I just missed a chunk there. So if this is a repetition, what I'm going to ask, maybe, you
That's fine.
know. But, I imagine there's some resonance around some of the political stuff. There's probably some similar views. So we are in like a little bit of a different space going forward, at least on some levels with Biden. Yeah. And, the Green New Deal, I know you have certain views on that. I'm curious, like, where do you see, like, what's sort of realistic about what's possible in the next 2, maybe 4 years, and where, what are some leverage points? Like, what do you see is possible, and where are we not to get our hopes up or not to be too, kind of like, what do you think is possible during this time, basically?
I think great question. I think near term, continuing to be a voice in these climate change and resiliency efforts that are going to continue to have a lot of fuel behind them, get involved with them as people who are thinking more about appropriate scales. I think that we're going to continue to see with the administration that's coming in a lot of momentum around climate change initiatives.
Yeah.
We're going to see a lot of momentum around things that have to do with trying to address health issues, right? So being an advocate for bringing more creativity and thoughtfulness to those conversations that are already happening, that need to be happening, and are moving in the right direction. I think that we're in a time where I am really excited to hear, for instance, just recently around the universal income topic, I actually heard on mainstream media them quoting King as somebody who is outspokenly pro universal basic income, right? And basically when they covered it as a news story, they said, why is this taking so long? There's no good answer for why it's taken so long, right? And we sure as hell aren't going to do it the way that Yang talked about, where we don't do Medicare for all. What a bunch of nonsense. We're going to do Medicare for all, and we're going to make sure that everybody has universal basic income. You don't like gut healthcare and then give people money. To what? Throw back at healthcare? What a bunch of nonsense, right? So I think we need to stay involved. We need to stay engaged. We need to keep a bead on things that are happening, that are positive, important things, and bring some of these kind of practical perspectives to them. Continuing to have a reality check on the climate change movement, to not just talk about carbon, to not just let existing contractors drive what our renewable initiatives are, to be careful of the notion that what we're going to do is somehow just continue with business as usual, but put a green coating on it all. We need to talk about why we need to decentralize infrastructure, and why we need to decentralize education, and why we need to bring about a better situation in this country for food independence and a more reliable and resilient infrastructure. So I think it's exciting times. I'm glad to see that we're going to be looking at some opportunities that previously I probably would have been thinking about how to get out of this country if anything hadn't gone the way that it did. So, nowhere to go but up. And let's keep a beat on the US military as a really bad actor who we need to continue to truncate and enormously cut funding to.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for elevating the debate, because we all feel, I'm sure, in our heart how important it is. It's not just our little garden in the backyard that we have, but it really touched on really how we want to live together.
Yeah,
that's what I love about permaculture and the work you're doing. For me, it's way beyond just putting a solar panel on my roof or collecting rainwater. Obviously, that might be good, but really it goes way beyond that. As for me, I feel a good citizen, of my community when I engage in that, because there's so much more, opportunity of a very different system, of a very different way to relate to our system, spend our money and buy the food and all of that. So thank you so much. I don't know if you have anything you want to say before we close, but I want to thank everybody. I'll leave you the last words if you want, but I want to thank everybody that come today, and everybody is going to watch the recording, and we'll send out an email. And Andrew, maybe I'll leave you with a few minutes if you want to say something to close, but thank you again so much for everything.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you all taking the time and interest and attention to think about our interrelationship here on this earth together, sharing what it is that we've been born into, and having some intentionality about how we live, where we want to go, what we want to create, and creating lives in the present and for the future that have integrity, that have dignity, and really showing unconditional love for our fellow human being, and trusting that as we care more for each other and we care more for this earth that we hold as a sacred trust that we've been handed by our ancestors and that we will hand to future generations, that is our great work that we want to stay aware of, appreciative of, celebrate, and recognize that it's not an easy path, that we need to stay healthy, we need to stay strong, and to trust yourself, to go outside and breathe and drink good water and be around caring and loving human beings who want to work together to live well on this earth. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, folks.
Thank you, everyone.
Stay in touch. Really appreciate the connection, virtual as it is.